Gladiatorial combat. A high-stakes game of slice the other guy before he slices you that ancient Romans considered prime entertainment. No healthcare, no retirement plan, and an alarmingly high workplace mortality rate. Welcome to life as a gladiator in ancient Rome. Most people think gladiators lived glamorous lives, swinging swords by day and attending wild Roman orgies by night. The reality? Less fame and fortune, and more pain and misfortune. So grab your rudimentary weapons and questionable armor as we explore why being history's most famous fighters was actually history's worst career choice. Let's start with how one typically became a gladiator. While some were volunteers, yes, there were actually people who thought, you know what sounds fun? Getting stabbed for entertainment. Most were prisoners of war, criminals, or slaves who had the misfortune of being purchased by a lanista, a gladiatorial school owner. Think of a lanista as a talent agent, if talent agents kept their clients in underground barracks and regularly sent them to potentially deadly job interviews. Take Tiberius Caro, a captured Thracian soldier who had the privilege of becoming property of Quintus Lentulus Batiatus, owner of a ludus, gladiatorial school, in Capua. Tiberius' first day went something like this. "Welcome to your new career," announced Batiatus, as guards stripped Tiberius of his possessions. "You'll be fighting for the entertainment of Romans who will cheer enthusiastically whether you win gloriously or die horribly. Mostly the latter if we're being honest. Now, please sign here." "Sign what?" asked Tiberius. "I don't see any papyrus. It's more of a metaphorical contract," explained Batiatus. "You agree to potentially die in horrible ways, and I agree to feed you just enough to keep you alive. Oh, and I'll also brand you to make sure everyone knows you're my property. Sound fair?" Before Tiberius could answer, he was already being dragged to receive his brand mark. Nothing says, "Welcome to your new job," like a hot iron pressed against your flesh. Let's talk about training. A charming combination of brutal physical conditioning and learning to die in an aesthetically pleasing manner. Gladiatorial schools were essentially ancient prison gymnasiums where you trained to either kill or provide an entertaining death. The daily routine consisted of waking at dawn, consuming a high-protein, high-carbohydrate diet. Gladiators were actually called barley men because of their grain-heavy diets, and practicing killing techniques until you collapsed from exhaustion. What made this worse was that gladiators deliberately put on fat. Archaeological evidence from gladiator graveyards, yes, they had special cemeteries just for them, shows they developed a protective layer of subcutaneous fat. This wasn't because they were lazy, it was strategic. A layer of fat protected blood vessels and nerves from shallow cuts, making wounds less deadly and fights more entertaining. Imagine being forced to gain weight just so your death would be slower and more amusing for the crowd. "Tiberius, you're not fat enough," shouted the doctor, the trainer at the ludus. "Eat more barley porridge." "But I've had 6 bowls already," protested Tiberius. "Not my problem. Romans don't want to see defined abdominals. They want to see your fat jiggle when you get stabbed. It's called entertainment. You uncultured barbarian." Let's discuss the living conditions, shall we? Gladiators lived in small cells, often chained to the walls at night. Privacy was non-existent, sanitation was minimal, and the only amenities were those deemed necessary to keep you alive and fighting fit. Think of it as a prison, but with deadlier yard time. "This is your cell," explained an older gladiator to Tiberius. "You'll share it with 3 others. That bucket in the corner is for bodily functions." "What about bathing?" asked Tiberius. The older gladiator laughed. "There's a communal bath once a week. Otherwise, the sweat and blood are considered part of your training regimen. The lanista believes it builds character." "And women? Surely as famous fighters we get to meet women. Oh, sweet summer child. The only women you'll meet are either the ones wealthy enough to pay for your services, or the ones throwing food at you in the arena." Sometimes both. Now let's get to the actual fighting. Contrary to popular belief, gladiatorial combat wasn't always to the death. In fact, most fights ended with surrender rather than death because training gladiators was expensive. Why kill a valuable asset when you could just humiliate him instead? But that doesn't mean the fighting wasn't brutal. Wounds, broken bones, and disfigurement were common occupational hazards. And the weapons? They weren't exactly designed with worker safety in mind. Different types of gladiators used different equipment. There were Thracians with small shields and curved swords, Secutors with helmets that covered their entire faces. Imagine fighting while essentially wearing a metal bucket on your head, and Retiarii with nets and tridents who fought nearly naked. The most unfortunate were probably the Dimacharists, who fought with two swords, which sounds cool until you realize they had no shield. Or perhaps it was the Esidarii, who fought from chariots in the cramped space of an arena, basically combining the dangers of NASCAR with the dangers of sword fighting. Tiberius was trained as a murmillo, which meant he had decent armor but carried a heavy shield and wore a helmet that restricted his peripheral vision. A delightful combination when someone is trying to stab you from the side. During his first real fight, Tiberius faced a retiarius named Marcus. "Begin!" shouted the editor, the official overseeing the games. Marcus immediately threw his net, entangling Tiberius's shield. As Tiberius struggled to free himself, sweat poured into his eyes from beneath his helmet. "I can't see a thing in this ridiculous headgear," he shouted, just before tripping over his own feet and falling face first into the sand. The crowd roared with laughter. "Get up, you barley-stuffed sack!" yelled a spectator, throwing half-eaten fruit that splattered against Tiberius's helmet. This brings us to another charming aspect of gladiatorial life: the crowd. Roman audiences were notoriously demanding. If they felt a gladiator wasn't fighting with enough enthusiasm, they would boo, throw things, and demand a more exciting performance. Nothing improves your fighting technique like having rotten vegetables hurled at you by angry spectators who paid good money to see blood. If you won, great. You lived to fight another day. If you lost but fought well, you might be spared. The defeated gladiator would drop his weapons and raise one finger, an appeal for mercy. Then the editor would look to the crowd, who would either turn their thumbs up, mercy, or down, death. Historians actually debate whether thumbs up meant life or death. But either way, imagine having your life depend on whether a crowd of bloodthirsty Romans enjoyed your performance enough to let you live. "Should we spare him?" asked the editor, gesturing to the defeated Tiberius. The crowd seemed divided. Half wanted him to live, perhaps impressed by his determination despite his obvious lack of talent. The other half wanted to see someone die after paying good money for tickets. "He fights like my grandmother, and she's been dead for 10 years, shouted one spectator. "But he took that fall so magnificently," argued another. In the end, Tiberius was spared, not because he fought well, but because the next match featured two female gladiators, and the crowd was eager to move on. Being saved because you're the opening act rather than the main event. Talk about a blow to the ego. Yes, female gladiators existed, though they were rarer than their male counterparts. Called Ludia or gladiatrix, these women fought under the same brutal conditions as men, although often with modified rules. They were typically novelty acts, because nothing says progressive thinking like watching women try to kill each other for entertainment. Let's say you survived long enough to earn your freedom. After winning numerous fights, a gladiator might be awarded the wooden sword, Rudis, symbolizing his freedom. But freedom didn't necessarily mean an easy life ahead. Many freed gladiators remained with their ludus as trainers because they had no other marketable skills beyond good at stabbing people. Others became bodyguards for wealthy Romans or even returned to the arena voluntarily because fighting was the only thing they knew. After 3 years and 17 fights, Tiberius earned his wooden sword. Standing before Batiatus, He felt a mix of pride and uncertainty. "Congratulations," said Batiatus, handing him the rudis. "You're free to go. Of course, you have no money, no place to live, and your only skill is fighting in a very specific context that doesn't translate well to conventional warfare. But you're free." "What will I do now?" asked Tiberius. "Most freed gladiators stay on as trainers or return to fighting voluntarily," explained Batiatus. "The pay is terrible, but at least you'll have a roof over your head and regular meals. And if I want to do something else? Like what? Become a senator? With your brand mark and reputation? I suppose you could try being a mercenary, but without the structure of the arena, most ex-gladiators end up dead in an alley somewhere." Health benefits were another non-existent perk of gladiatorial life. While gladiatorial schools did employ physicians, ancient Roman medicine was a terrifying combination of somewhat practical knowledge and complete nonsense. Got a wound? They might clean it with wine, actually effective, and then pack it with sheep dung, decidedly less effective. Broken bone? Here's some willow bark to chew on for pain, while we set it without anesthesia. These physicians, known as medici, were primarily concerned with keeping gladiators alive and fighting, not with their long-term health. Chronic pain, permanent disabilities, and disfiguring scars were just part of the job. "The physician will see you now," a servant told Tiberius after a particularly rough fight that left him with a deep gash in his thigh. The medicus examined the wound. "Good news. It's not immediately fatal." "And the bad news?" asked Tiberius. "Everything else. I'll need to cauterize this. Hold him down." He instructed his assistants, heating a metal rod in a brazier. As they pressed Tiberius's limbs against the table, the medicus offered him a strip of leather. "Bite on this, and try not to scream too loudly. There's a poetry reading next door, and the poet complained about the noise last time." Perhaps the greatest irony of gladiatorial life was that despite the fame, the cheering crowds, and occasional romantic attention from wealthy women, most gladiators died anonymous deaths. If they weren't famous enough to merit a proper burial, their bodies might be disposed of unceremoniously. Archaeological evidence shows mass graves of gladiators, their bones bearing the marks of their violent profession. So the next time you think being a gladiator would be cool, remember Tiberius Caro and the reality of gladiatorial life. Brutal training, poor living conditions, dangerous fights, and a retirement plan that consisted mainly of try not to die. They lived and died for entertainment. Their pain transformed into spectacle. Their blood spilled to satisfy the Roman appetite for violence. In the end, the true glory of being a gladiator was simply surviving long enough to not be one anymore. Assuming, of course, that your idea of glory involves being force-fed barley porridge, fighting for the amusement of people who've placed bets on your death, and having your life literally hanging on a thumbs up. As Tiberius himself eventually concluded while training new recruits, "The only thing worse than being a gladiator is everything about being a gladiator."